Our second session today, titled Innovating Responsibly, Getting AI Systems into Production, is a panel discussion that delves into strategies for balancing innovation with ethical standards to ensure AI integration that's both impactful and trustworthy. Please welcome to the stage our esteemed and incredibly trustworthy speakers, George Mathew, Chloé Bakalar, Gaurab Bansal, and Sarah Bird.
Okay. Well, we have the easy topic today, which is responsible AI. So what I thought I'd do is, there's a lot going on in the world right now, particularly when it comes to building more responsible systems. And we have some of the most amazing people in the world thinking and working through that as we speak. So maybe the first starting point in the conversation is, maybe Gaurab, you want to kick off and just answer what exactly does responsible AI mean these days?
Sure, I'll take a cut at it. Thanks for having me. I'll start with responsible AI being both mindset and methodology. So for us, our organization's a nonprofit, Responsible Innovation Labs. We work mostly with startups. So I think the three things we think about, what is the mindset you're bringing to it, which is sort of good business practice. How are you getting ahead of your risks, of course? How are you earning trust with your customers? How are you attracting the best talent? That's sort of the mindset, the culture. I think for startups in particular, you have to be very focused on your use case. What is your resource bandwidth? Obviously, Sarah's at Microsoft, Chloe's at Meta, very different resource capacity. So what a startup should do for responsible AI is very different than what obviously large companies should do. And then methodology. So we would encourage you in a very quick rundown of obviously aligning your team. It's very simple. It's like, who's doing this? Who's running it? Is it the founder? Are you deputizing somebody? What are you forecasting in terms of risks and benefits? Auditing, testing. And then, there has to be some appropriate transparency, certainly within the company, maybe external to your stakeholders. We talk a lot about curating your data, because that's obviously going to impact the quality of the AI tool. And then obviously continuous improvement.
So Chloé, I think you're one of the first folks in the industry that's been kind of officially focused on the idea of ethics at the scale that you're doing at Meta right now. Tell us a little bit more about that journey at Meta, your own personal journey in terms of working through some of these real ethical challenges that are emerging, particularly as AI systems are coming to scale. And what should the audience know more about what's happening in the world of responsible for Meta?
Great. So a nice small question.
Yeah, always small questions for me. I try to take it easy on the panel.
Yeah. Well, so my journey into big tech has been somewhat unorthodox. I started working with big companies back after I got my PhD in the very early stages of AI ethics, when it was just becoming a term that industry was using a little bit, but academia certainly wasn't. And so we had this intuition that academics probably had something to bring to the conversation, but for that to be helpful, we needed to understand what was going on at companies. And so co-founded a program at Princeton that really tried to create this pipeline between industry, academia, which was great and a lot of fun and really interesting. And then in 2018, when Meta, which was then called Facebook, decided that they wanted to start investing in what was going to become responsible AI, although we didn't have the language for that yet. They sought me out and they're like, well, you've been super critical of the company. So, tell us what we could do, how we can help be more responsible in the way that we're developing AI, better integrate ethics throughout the product development process. And that's really what sold me on the role. Instead of ethics and AI being a function that's purely in compliance or purely in research, the gamble that we took as Facebook, as Meta, was to embed ethics within the entire product development process. So from ideation all the way through launch, and then all of the post-launch evals, and you come to know.
Yep. Well, we'll talk more about Llama and what you've been up to there in a moment. But I just want to get to Sarah really quickly here. There's been a shift at Microsoft, particularly when it comes to thinking through responsible AI. And Sarah, I think you were off stage a few days ago kind of mentioning where the direction on security and trustworthiness is all headed. Maybe you can spend a little bit of time in the world of Microsoft, particularly as you're really helping enterprises work through the challenges of building AI systems, how you think about responsible systems, trustworthy systems?
Yeah, I think actually, I will add a little bit to what Chloé said in terms of it being a somewhat similar journey at Microsoft, where we started first by forming, a research group, right? When we didn't even really know like how to think about the topic. And research was great at showing kind of potential issues or interesting ideas or techniques, but we really didn't know, how do we want to put this into practice in our products? And so the next step in our journey was forming for us our Office of Responsible AI, which is our policy leadership. And the policy leadership went and did exactly what a good internal policy team should do, which is set a standard for how we should implement responsible AI in the company. And we went to start implementing that standard, and we realized we had no idea how to do it. Because we didn't have much implementation experience, the policy wasn't really written in a way to be implementable. So I sort of joke that it said things like, think about making your system fair, and then do that, right? And engineering teams were asking, well, how do I do that? And what does fair mean? And what are this? And so my role in the company is the third leg of the stool, as we say, which is how we actually put these in practice for everything from like identifying new risks through technical solutions to sort of the compliance process. And we needed all of those pieces to actually make it work. And so the journey has really been about expanding the field. And so the latest change that George was alluding to is we're finding in the era of generative AI, there's a responsible AI community. People kind of identify with it. A lot of people think it means, like fairness is a word that comes to mind pretty often with that. But we're finding that there are an expanding set of risks with generative AI that really mean we need to bring in other communities as well. So security, for example, is part of our responsible AI principles, but most of the security community doesn't think they're doing responsible AI, but they are asking now, how do we secure AI? And so we need to bring in like lots more legal expertise as we look at issues like IP and copyright. And so we recently started kind of talking instead about the outcome we want, which is trustworthy AI systems that are worthy of our trust, that you can control and all of that. And we're finding that has allowed us to sort of expand our practice and bring in these additional communities that we need. And I'm sure we're not done on this journey. The more and more we learn, the more communities we need to like come in and support kind of the practice of making AI systems, the outcome that we want them to be.
I really love Sarah's answer here, and it brought up for me something that I think has been a challenge within responsible AI circles, but really within the broader tech industry, is that there's a misalignment between what people tend to think of as responsible AI and the value that it brings, and what it actually is. So for example, security is a huge part of how we do responsibility work. That was true for traditional AI. It's even more true now for generative AI. I like to say, even on the fairness side, right? AI that is fairer, is more robust, is more accurate, is more reliable, right? All of these dimensions of responsibility work aren't necessarily separate or added on to how we build good AI or good generative AI. It's intrinsic to the process, and I think the more we can get that message across, the more we can appreciate how much responsibility work is actually happening, often by people who don't necessarily realize that they're doing it or wouldn't identify it as such. Honestly, I think we can see the full breadth of just how far we've come over the past few years.
And so is there any reason why that particular security shift has really come to focus for Microsoft? I mean, I know that there are some real concerns of what's coming, but clearly Microsoft was kind of thinking ahead of the curve as well in terms of really folding in security into the idea of trustworthiness and responsibility.
Yeah, I think that security has always been a big part of the work at Microsoft. In fact, when we think about how we're building responsible AI, I learn a lot from the people that were at Microsoft during the security transition when that became a huge thing and what they needed to do to kind of bring that to everybody in the company. But I think that for a long time, kind of the standard security practices were good enough for securing your AI systems. And so we didn't need as much co-innovation. And with generative AI, we're seeing new types of attacks, like prompt injection attacks coming through the user flow or through the data. And so we're starting now to see a lot more intermingling between how we need to push the boundaries in security and what we need to do for AI. I think that we see higher adversarial use of this technology as well. And so a lot of the things that security is already great at, like incident response, monitoring, all of that, we've had to extend to work for AI. Probably one of the easiest examples of something that we've done that we needed to do to intermix is red teaming is an important practice for testing AI systems. And red teaming historically just looked at security risk. But when we want to red team a new technology, for example, we get a new model that we've never seen before, like when GPT-4 came out, it was a big step up and we didn't really know what could it do. And so we brought together red teamers to do this, but we actually needed red teamers with a huge range of expertise, everything from child safety, legal and copyright issues, fairness that we talked about, privacy, traditional security, new types of attacks, all of that. And so we built an AI red team inside of Microsoft that actually can test over this range of risk or find the expert that they need to help contribute to that. And so we built on the security practice, but we had to extend it for AI. And so I think we're just seeing with this wave of tech that now is the time where this is just much, much more needed. And of course, unfortunately, we're seeing huge rise every single year in threat actors and the attacks we're seeing. And so I don't have the statistic right now, but I believe that these attacks are one of actually the largest anti-economies in the world, but they're as large as a real economy, and it's pretty terrible. And so the surface is just getting worse in that sense too. And so now is the time to invest in this.
Well, let's spend a little bit of time just on that geopolitical level for a moment, right? Because as we're starting to now see the level of state actors that are becoming more and more sophisticated, we have probably a number of things that have emerged from a regulatory standpoint more recently. I'd say, with the EU Act a few years ago, starting to lay down a few things now that the Biden executive order is now in the dumpster fire, and we're going to have to now think about what happens next. Perhaps, Gaurab, if you can spend a few seconds on what's happened up to this point from a regulatory standpoint, particularly around the EU Act, now that we have a new administration coming in. How do we think about literally the changes in policy that are likely coming? I know you've spent plenty of time, particularly in DC, around these topics in the last several weeks.
Yeah, for better or worse, yes.
Yeah, so it's a good moment to at least talk to everyone in terms of how they should think about the next few years.
For sure. I'll certainly defer to both of you a little bit more on the implementation of the EU AI Act. Let's just talk trend lines, because I think it's still early to make predictions on policy. But obviously, the EU AI Act is coming to force, so there will be a lot of work on implementation there, largely with larger firms. In the US, we have the Biden executive order, which largely set forth a voluntary regime. And the AI Safety Institutes, if you're familiar with, the US has a relatively new AI Safety Institute stood up in the Department of Commerce. It's sort of awkward timing, but all of the global AI Safety Institutes are convening next week in San Francisco. Our organization is doing an event with Elizabeth Kelly, who runs the US AI Safety Institute. So if you're in San Francisco next week, let me know. We'd love to have you there. And so we'll be very curious to hear from her what the plans are with respect to that regime. I spent some time on the Hill in October, mostly with Republicans, because I worked in the Obama administration. I don't know the Republicans as well. And I certainly got a feel for how they're thinking about AI. I don't sense a huge appetite to regulate AI right now, frankly, from Republicans or Democrats. Part of that is this confluence of factors. There's a strong hawkish approach to China. And that sort of maybe is perceived as cutting against the need for regulation right now. We have strong concerns about regulatory capture with our big colleagues here. I'll let you guys talk about that. And it's a sense that it's also early. So I think the Congress has been in a learning posture. But looking ahead to next year, they'll be very focused on tax. They'll be because the expiration of the Trump tax cuts are coming. They'll be very focused on immigration because that's what President-elect Trump is very focused on. So I think from just like a mind share perspective, it's not clear to me that they will be focused on AI absent a crisis. Congress does two things very well: nothing or overreact. And overreaction, I say this like tongue in cheek, but I think part of the challenge of what we say at Responsible Innovation Labs is if industry, and I don't mean big tech here, I mean startups are not putting good faith efforts forward on responsible AI, the likelihood of overregulation is much higher. The likelihood of regulation hampering startups is much, much higher. And so it's really imperative, not just for business reasons, but frankly from positioning and good faith to show up. I will just say one more thing, George, which is states will now feel, I would say like we already saw in California, those of you who live in California, SB 1047 did not get signed by Governor Newsom, but did pass both houses, both chambers there overwhelmingly. I'd be shocked if, from a policy perspective, there's not another run at something like that in California. And I know I'm going to stay focused on policy, but I will just say from a political point of view, there will be any number of Democratic governors who may see an opportunity on this issue at the state level. And I think it's bad for startups to have a patchwork of rules. We already have one vis-a-vis the EU and the US. And I think that sort of bears watching as sort of when I talk to startups, I'm sorry, George, one more point, which is the role of enterprise in setting standards. We've got startups in our network who have like 5, 10 different standards from enterprise customers. It's very hard to scale when you don't have a common standard. And the regulation is not really helping that right now.
Sarah and Chloe, anything you want to comment on the policy side of things as far as where we're going to see the next few years play out?
Yeah, maybe I can add a little bit that, we're spending a lot of time on implementing the EU AI Act right now because it's, come into force and we're starting to have, and next year we'll have the first milestones for complying coming up. And of course, the act is sprawling and a lot of the interpretations of what things mean aren't really going to be clear until we get into the sort of code of practice coming out. But a couple things that might be sort of helpful in terms of how we're looking at it and helpful for startups is, a lot of, at the high level of what it's asking to do is just good sense. Like it should already be in your responsible AI practice. So for example, if you're building models, you should probably govern the data that's going into them. If you're building models, you should probably test them, right? And if you're consuming a model, you're building an AI system, again, you should make sure that you're testing it, that you're appropriately mitigating risk. And so a lot of what we see in terms of how we're implementing this is really that it's just a pipe cleaner in terms of making sure that we're ready for regulation overall and doing these things. And it's not that it's so specific to that one regulation. And a lot of it was already, part of our responsible AI practice. But this always, outside perspective, outside requirements always force you to really look at it and make sure you mature it. And the thing I wanted to say for startups is actually, we often have the idea that it's going to be harder for like a startup to comply with a regulation. But a lot of this actually, if you're a smaller organization and you're just starting, a lot of this is easier if you're doing it from scratch. So if you're, for example, needing to govern your data, invest in a solution right now for that when you have a small amount of data, and then you'll just continue with that practice as you go. If you have a large amount of data and you have to go find all of it in the company and actually build it into a new governance structure, that is much, much harder. And so definitely encourage people to look at the shapes of either executive orders or regulations and start thinking about like what are the patterns and how you want to implement now, because it will be easier actually than trying to bolt it on after. And there's a lot of commonalities across all of them.
Can I make one friendly
Please.
Strong +1 to starting early. Hard to retrofit for this stuff as you scale. I would say the challenge on regulation as it emerges, that's the sort of friendly amendment, is where is disclosure, like the disclosure requirements for a Meta and Microsoft, given the capacity you have, can't be applied to a startup. I think that's like the wrinkle that we have to kind of work through as on the regulation side, but I completely 100% agree, the earlier you start, the better.
Well, let's spend a few minutes on the foundation models themselves, right? Because there's been a lot of controversy about how fast the evolution of the foundation models themselves have been. A lot of the effective accelerationists have said, move even faster. A bunch of the effective altruists, like Dario at Anthropic, have said we really do need to slow down. There's a number of conversations that are happening from a regulatory standpoint, of course, on do we move faster or slower? What does that mean for competition in the world? So maybe we can start with a little bit more of the thinking on why should we move as fast as we are in terms of innovation around the foundation models. And I know Llama's been continuing to iterate, particularly in the open source community. So maybe, Chloé, you can start off with that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, right, that there's reasons why the technology is advancing so quickly. For one thing, sometimes that's just the way innovation happens. You build off of a spark and it just keeps going.
And then in some cases, some things go very slow, like AI for a while, and then
whoosh,
hyper-accelerates
exactly.
like it has been.
And there is a real first mover advantage when we're talking about this kind of new technology. So there's also an incentive industry-wide to take this quick pace of innovation and to move it forward. I think about, I think sometimes when we talk about speed, though, we're sort of talking about the wrong dimension of it. Speed isn't by itself a problem, right? In fact, when we think about the incredible opportunities that these technologies bring, the positive value that they can add, and now I'm specifically thinking about sort of the global south and areas that have not had the kind of opportunities to build up their own tech communities, their own small businesses and startups. For them, time is important. They want this stuff now, right? They want it as soon as possible and as soon as we can get it out. So I think thinking of time as necessarily, or speed as necessarily a bad thing, points us in some problematic directions where we miss this group of stakeholders. I think instead we should be trying to work within the incentives that already exist to make sure that as we're moving quickly, we're doing so very deliberately and we're doing it thoughtfully, right? That we're taking the time, which is not necessarily all that onerous, right? To really understand the choices that we're making and the kinds of trade-offs that they imply, right? If we're building, for speed, to what extent is that potentially trading off against something like fairness? Are we okay with that? What is the right balance that we need to strike? And being ready to defend those kinds of decisions with, again, a thoughtful and deliberate approach. So I think, instead of worrying that we're moving too fast, I think we need to be making sure that within this environment we're moving purposefully, right, and knowingly, and with a little bit of humility too.
I love that answer.
Yeah.
Sarah, how do you think about that, particularly with your colleagues at Microsoft?
Yeah, it's something we get asked a lot, and I think for us, we have been working at this a really long time. Our responsible AI practice now is almost 10 years old, and it's been a journey. And so for a lot of people, when ChatGPT burst onto the scene, that was the first time they really thought about this technology, and so it feels crazy fast. Like, I didn't even know this existed, and now it's like in my face. But the reality is, for example, at Microsoft, we had already shipped a major generative AI application in production before that, GitHub Copilot. And that, for example, helped us build a lot of the foundational safety systems that we still use today. And of course, as the technology matures, then we also advance what we're doing there. But we've been working for many years now to be able to move quickly, because we've been working at building that foundation that allows us to be agile and allows us to iterate. And so I do want to agree with what Chloé was saying, that when I look at my role in this and why we're doing this, the technology has so much potential for good in the world. It has the ability to basically be a bridge to all other technologies, because it meets people where they are. And so they're able to express things in their own language and their own style and still control a more complex system or navigate government bureaucracy. One of the people we work with here is the New York City Department of Education, which famously banned ChatGPT at the beginning when it came out. And then they realized, we're actually not educating our children if we don't teach them how to work with this technology. And so they've been working with us to develop an in-house chat system. They've deployed that in schools now. And one of the things they shared with us that I thought was really inspiring is that some of the students who perhaps don't speak English at home, for example, are less comfortable asking questions in class. They're seeing much higher engagement with them in the chat system. So they're still getting now personalized answers to their questions. And of course, we don't know yet if this is going to change educational outcomes for them. But this idea that this can help empower everyone, I think, is so important on this. The other thing is the technology is going to have huge impact across industries, business, society, and almost no one had an opinion about it, how we should govern it, how we should regulate it, what it should and shouldn't do, until they could touch it. So the longer that we keep it in the lab and don't allow the people that are going to be most impacted to actually experience, to interact with it, there's huge risk in that as well. And so completely agree with Chloe's point of we have to make sure we're doing that the right way. We are, mitigating risk that we would see as, not proportional to the benefit we're getting and things, but it is also a huge cost to not bring this technology into the world, and so that has to be part of the conversation when you're talking about how quickly you need to move.
So I want to push our thinking a little forward for the next 5-10 years, right? We're now in a moment here where we've built relatively aligned systems up to this point, right? The emergence of GPT-4 and all the sort of similar models to GPT-4 were incredibly well aligned just because of how we used RLHF, or reinforcement learning through human feedback, and other techniques to just keep the model very strongly aligned. Now, here's a moment that we can see 5 years, 10 years, who knows, 15 years, maybe even sooner, where we're going to approach a super intelligent set of systems. And the challenge with a super intelligent set of systems is that humans likely can't align those models themselves. So how do we think about that, particularly in this sort of disconnect between the models becoming smarter than humans themselves and us kind of falling out of alignment with the models kind of doing what humans want them to do?
Can I dispute both parts
Sure,
of
please.
that question?
Please do. I love this.
So first to the question of superintelligence.
Unfortunately, it's 3 minutes, so
Sure,
we're going to be careful on how much we can dispute it. Yeah.
So to the question of superintelligence, I don't think that we should be taking for granted that it'll be here in 5, 10, even 20 years.
Could never happen, you mean?
And I know I'm not the only one. I'm certainly not the loudest voice at Meta saying that much too. But I think that focusing too much on that side of the conversation means that we tend to divert attention and focus away from the work that needs to be happening right now, which I know both of the other panelists are really deeply invested in. And doing that kind of work helps set us up for this non-techno-determinist future where maybe superintelligence never comes to be, but if it does, it's from the ground up built with this kind of responsibility mindset. In terms of alignment, though, I think people love that word, but there's no, what it means is alignment with human values. That's the full phrase. And we as humans have never been able to align with human values. We don't agree. We don't agree on what they are even, right? We might be able to agree on some superset of human values that most cultures think are somewhat important, but only most. And within that, then when we start defining what those values are, we get enormous disagreement, and then how they relate to each other, how we prioritize, even more. So saying that our existing systems are aligned with human values sort of suggests a kind of very narrow idea of what those values are. And I think it also moves us away from the way that these kinds of technologies will need to be managed. It won't be by trying to get all of them to have the same set of human values that somehow we all seem to agree on, like in this room, on this panel. It could be a lot
more diverse over time.
Yeah, well, on this panel, right, we probably all have very different value systems or very different priorities. And the way that we manage societies of people isn't by trying to get all of us to agree on the same values. It's by creating institutions and infrastructure that enable, beings or agents that are different to interact and behave in ways that are predictable and effective. And probably that's the space that we need to be investing in, this greater infrastructure around how to deal with different AI systems, different AIs that promote different kinds of values, and we can cordon off some really bad ones. But
yeah, maybe I can add just a little bit to that, which is I think there are two interesting sort of challenges in when people are talking about alignment that are actually relevant right now. The first is, how do you have the correct human oversight? And obviously an easy solution is, and this is what we see in chat interfaces as well, there's a human in the loop, they're gonna look at every output, right, and decide whether or not to use it or something. But then as we see systems become perhaps doing more complex tasks, and maybe the human user is not the right person to audit that, and instead you should look at the testing system and have humans certify the testing system. And over time, you might see humans even kind of farther out in where they sit in governance. But this journey of what is the right role of the human in the task and the governance is something we're already working on, and we're going to continue to have to advance. The other one that I think Chloe was speaking to is, how do you give customization and control? So one of the things we see with model alignment is people are trying to build the stuff right into the model. But for example, this type of AI has been a huge step forward in terms of what we can do for safety. But that means I use it, for example, to generate harmful content, to train classifiers to then watch for that. Well, if the alignment is built in to not let the model do it, that actually gives me fewer tools for defense, right?
Yep.
Same thing on the security side. And so we want to build platforms that are configurable so that you can set them for the right deployment context for the right application. And so we don't want a one-size-fits-all. And this is a challenge we already have now that just needs to keep being extended as the technology becomes more sophisticated.
which is a big part, by the way, just to plug Llama, right? A big part of how we develop in the tools that we create for developers around Llama, making sure that they're developer customizable. And we set a baseline of safety, but then since the technology is meant to meet people where you are and to provide actual value to users and to trust them to know what that value is, give lots of opportunities to customize.
Amazing. Okay, so one last question, lightning round, 30 seconds each. Person, if we can say the one thing you would do right now to get practical about deploying responsible, trustworthy systems as you're coming into production in the enterprises and the people you serve. Please. Anyone can start. So.
I don't want to start.
I'll say two things. One is get started. Start having the conversation about how your organization should do it. Number two, start testing your systems, right? Testing shows you a lot of what is actually going on, and that is a great way to then figure out, to start the rest of the conversation about what you need to do.
You want to go?
Yeah, I think, well, now I'm gonna be stealing from Sarah, but I think forcing yourself to have difficult conversations, and I'd point this at big companies like Meta or like Microsoft, but also to the startup community. Have hard conversations, have them early, have them often, right? So I'm the chief ethicist at Meta. I get a lot of questions around ethics, obviously. And you don't want that first question of oh my God, I think there's a real ethics conundrum here to happen after launch. You'll get some of those because you won't know what's gonna happen really until after launch. But you wanna start asking those questions at the beginning. Don't be afraid of them. Be thoughtful about who's in the room to help answer them, especially for these really thorny areas. It should probably not just be one individual or one sort of homogenous group. Ask hard questions often.
Yeah, I'll give you two things. If this is more for a startup crowd, is I would actually put together your talk track or deck on what your practices are. If I find you in the hall today and I'm like, what's your responsible AI program? I hope there's not 3 minutes of silence. So one, your customers will want that.
Yeah,
particularly your enterprise
yeah.
customers will want that. And if you're direct to consumer, you may want that. Regulators may want that. So having something documented, put together, it does not have to be perfect. It has to be consistent with your resource constraints, where you are, your use case, but have something that you can build off of. It's the output of all these conversations that my colleagues are talking about, and then go get help. we're Responsible Innovation Labs. Obviously, come talk to us, but you could talk to your lawyers, talk to your investors. Shout out to Insight Partners who've been great supporters of us. Like, go talk to people who are thinking about this and can pattern match across a lot of different use cases.
And it can't just be a list of principles that are so vague as to be nothing. Going back to an early comment from Sarah, right? These things need to be operationalizable. Principles are a place to start, but think about how you actually build them.
And I will just add, customers will demand this of you. This is something that has changed in the most recent wave of AI. Customers will ask. This is not optional.
Yes.
Chloé, Gaurab, Sarah, thank you so much for an incredible job on the panel today.
Thank you.